Module 1 explores World War II as a shock to the world system. By definition, wars represent an interruption of the natural order. But World War II was unique in terms of the scale of its devastation, the global radius of its destruction, the level and index of civilian suffering, and the brutal degree to which military might pursued ideological vision. From Tokyo and Manila to Warsaw and Coventry, this war churns cities of life into desolate piles of rubble. In the process, the conflict rattled the pillars of the previous world order, scarred contemporaries, and ensured that a new international system would emerge in its destructive weight. World War II had not emerged in a vacuum. In fact, in many ways, the conflict was the culmination of the collapse of the previous world system. The previous world system had been constructed upon relatively unstable foundations. One pillar of this world order was European imperialism. During the late 19th century, Europe's great powers had dramatically expanded their global influence, constructing empires that incorporated most of the non-Western world into a structure of European control. In the process, they had dramatically transformed local life and stimulated a rising tide of resentment as non-Western peoples demanded reforms and a greater voice in their own affairs. Second pillar of this world system was the ideology of racial Darwinism. Many statesmen applied Darwin's theory of natural evolution to describe international relations. According to this way of looking at things, the international arena constituted a hostile jungle in which powerful states prospered and the weaker races became extinct or were exterminated. World War II was also the product of a global economic depression. The world had never experienced a calamity like the Great Depression that struck in 1929. International trade collapsed, and the process of this, the social contract, dissolved. Ordinary people couldn't feed their families or find work. In the process, they were cast into doubt. What was the use of liberal democracy? Parliaments were unable to cope with the crisis. Laissez-faire capitalism had been exposed as a failure. People were attracted by radical doctrines and extremist points of view. Fascism was one of these ideologies that promised a solution to the hardships of the Great Depression. Finally, World War II was the product of the collapse of the Versailles system. In 1919, Wilson had traveled to Paris. In the process, he had ridden a wave of international hope by promising to repair the international system and ending war for the future generation. But from the viewpoint of the 1930s, the Versailles system hadn't resolved anything. It had in fact alienated Germany, Japan, and Italy from the international settlement. And by the late 1930s, it was clear that rather than ending war for all time, the Versailles settlement had actually set the stage for a more devastating sequel conflict. I suppose every war is unique in its own particular way, but there's little disputing that World War II was the most devastating conflict in world history. Several features set World War II apart from previous conflicts. The first was the doctrine of total war. Belligerent states went to extraordinary lengths to mobilize their citizens and their natural resources for the war effort. In a very real sense, citizens became soldiers outside of uniform, fighting on the home front. In Canada, for example, children were recruited in order to recycle cans for the war effort. women were invited onto the factory floor to replace their men recruited to serve. In all these ways, ordinary citizens were mobilized for the war effort, where private businesses like Ford, were redirected to construct planes and tanks for the war effort. Another thing that set World War II apart was simply the scale of devastation. Certainly World War I had proven devastating as well, but most of the carnage had been on the front lines. What was different in World War II was the degree to which the war raged behind front lines, and particularly with the use of aerial bombardment. What this meant is that cities in their entirety were devastated. In 1945, for example, 90% of the housing in Warsaw had been destroyed. Berlin and Tokyo were similarly leveled. And this meant that with the devastation of mines, factories, and infrastructure, bridges and railroads, rebuilding would be a very difficult task. There's no disputing that World War I had been a global war as well. But it had been global principally in the sense that the belligerents had been global empires that mobilized these resources for the war in Europe. World War II was global in a much more fundamental sense. Not only did war rage in Europe, but also in the Pacific and North Africa. In the process, many more people were directly implicated in the conflict. Arguably, the feature that most set World War II apart was the doctrine of annihilation war. World War II was provoked by the Axis powers, and they were fascist states. The fascist states had embraced violence as a virtue. They saw violence as a sublime expression of their racial vigor, and they pursued war in a fundamentally different way. War was not simply about national security and conquest. War was a mission to subjugate one's neighbors and to exterminate lesser races. This meant that genocide and ethnic cleansing were built into the blueprint of World War II. And as a result, civilians would suffer to a much greater degree than they ever had in the past. World War I had really been an infantryman's war. The suffering in the trenches was horrendous. But the typical casualty was a young male in the trenches of Europe. The most typical casualty of World War II was an unarmed civilian. Over 30 million civilians died in World War II, many of them the target of racial violence. One of the ways to gain a sense for how World War II was perceived as a global catastrophe is to simply chronicle the various atrocities that define this conflict. Obviously, the most famous or infamous atrocity of World War II was the Holocaust, the Nazi campaign and ambition to exterminate the Jews as a people. Now, there were various dimensions of the Holocaust. What the image on the left depicts are the Einsatzgruppen, mobile task forces that traveled behind the invading Wehrmacht in Russia in 1941. Their basic task was to surround Jewish villages, round up all their inhabitants, and instruct them to dig a pit. Once they completed this labor, they were often placed at the lip of the pit and then machine gunned or shot to death, the bodies falling under the weight of gravity into the pit, and then they were buried, some of the victims even alive. And of course, this was just one dimension of the Nazi war of extermination that also targeted other undesirable racial groups. Now, the fascist powers were certainly innovators in terms of these very radical ideas of annihilation war. They weren't just fighting wars of conquest, but they were striving to establish a new world order, and genocide and ethnic cleansing were embedded inside their war plans. But they didn't have a monopoly on violence. The Allies responded to fascist atrocities in kind. One of the most famous Allied atrocities was the bombing of Dresden. Though Dresden had been spared Allied bombing before because it wasn't really an industrial or military center. In September 17 in 1945, over 3 state days of raiding, over 100,000 civilians were killed. Many of the civilians actually died in air raid shelters because the incendiary bombs and fires burned so hot that it literally sucked the oxygen out of the lungs of children. The Allies also used white phosphorus, which could burn through the ground, leach into air raid shelters. If it came upon a human hand, it couldn't be doused with water. In fact, it would usually burn through the hand and sometimes land on one's foot, where it would continue burning through this tissue. So, Dresden bombing was just, kind of emblematic of a Western campaign of terror, in which certainly, interdicting enemy industry was one objective, but terrorizing civilians and convincing them to end the war was another subsidiary objective. Another horrifying massacre was the 1937-1938 rape of Nanking. When the Chinese had resisted Japanese invitations to join the Japanese Empire, the Japanese troops became enraged. When they pulled into the Chinese imperial capital of Nanking, the rank-and-file soldiers of the Japanese went on a rampage. For about 4 months, they in an unchecked way, started to slaughter civilian residents of Nanking. Often this involved rape, but it also included looting, arson, and murder. The degree to which individual soldiers participated and seemed to take sadistic pleasure in torturing civilians by cutting off the breasts of women or mutilating their genitalia showed the degree to which fascist indoctrination had succeeded in dehumanizing the Chinese as a lesser people, maybe even simply animals fit for slaughter. In this way, the Nanking Massacre served as a preview for how World War II would not be war in a traditional key, and how civilians would suffer grievously during this conflict. Another famous atrocity of World War II was the Russian invasion of Berlin at the end of the war. From Berlin, Hitler had given the orders for Germany to launch its annihilation war upon Russia. And the German troops had behaved savagely. They had killed over 10 million Russian civilians. They starved to death over 1 million Russian troops in the first few months of 1941. So when the war turned and Russian troops showed up on Berlin, it was understood that this would be a battle in which no quarter would be given or expected. And the Russian troops fought bitterly from house to house, suffering over 30,000 casualties in the process. They also raped along the way. It's estimated that within a single week, 200,000 German women were raped, many of them repeatedly. So this is one of the famous atrocities of. Another famous atrocity of World War II was the bombing of Hiroshima in 1945. The nuclear bomb had been developed against Nazi Germany, but by May 1945 they had surrendered. Truman decided in August 1945 that the nuclear bomb would be used as a way to entice Japan, which had already lost the war, to surrender. But the nuclear bomb was a weapon of mass destruction. When it exploded over Hiroshima above a hospital, as it turned out, 40,000 people were vaporized instantly. Another 40,000 or so would die within the following week, mostly from the effect of wounds suffered by the bombing. Some of them had radiation burns. Others were wounded when the buildings they were in collapsed. As you can see from the image, the only thing that survived in Hiroshima were stone structures, but most of the city was constructed from wood and bamboo and was completely leveled by the blast. Another less famous atrocity was the Katyn Forest massacre. One of the things to remember is that Stalin had begun the war as Hitler's partner, and during 1939 he had colluded with Hitler in invading Poland and participated in a lot of the same atrocities. In particular, he had arrested the Polish elite, clergymen, businessmen, cultural figures, government officers, and military personnel. And in 1940 and 1941, they were systematically shot to death and exterminated inside Belarusia. By profiling these various atrocities, we get a sense for how World War II impacted people across the globe. World War II was war in a new key. The fascist powers were the belligerents, and they were pursuing a philosophy of annihilation war, which guaranteed atrocities that would hit hard upon civilians. Prisoners were systematically mistreated. Many hundreds of millions of people were subject to occupation regimes and persecuted. And these very radical ideas led to the mistreatment and extermination of undesirable groups. In the actual conduct of war, civilian massacres and terrorism was justified. A lot of the experience of World War II was also affiliated with total war mobilization. Even in the Western states, civilians were mobilized for war. They weren't immune to the conflict taking place in the trenches because aerial bombardment transformed the battlefield into cities of life. Railroads, bridges were leveled. There was rationing and shortages. Many people experienced World War II as hunger. Certainly if you were occupied by the fascist states, you were subject to very draconian rules. But even inside Canada and Britain, your civil rights were curtailed. What World War II meant to ordinary people was long work for miserable wages and adjusting to very new circumstances. It wasn't just women working in factories, but young men were sent to alien environments. Children had to adjust to new circumstances. But arguably the people that suffered the most were those that were occupied, in many cases for many years, by the fascist powers. Because the fascist powers were really pursuing these very radical ideas. They saw their enemy not just as defeated peoples, but lesser races. And this meant that occupied peoples suffered humiliation, degradation, hunger, and even